Hello, everyone. Is literary culture dead? Now, before we get to that, if you would like to support this channel, if you want to keep literary culture alive, you can purchase my book, The Ecstasy and the Ignominy. Um, it is um, a kind of like a combination between A Tale of Two Cities and Anna Karenina. It's written in a very Shakespearean, Melvillian, Dickensian kind of style. Um, I think you would really enjoy it if you want to keep literary culture alive. Um, be- I just thought I would get that out of the way because it does relate somewhat to what I'm talking about. Now, what I mean by literary is literary culture dead is that it seems to me that that there aren't really new works, new great works being created. There aren't literary works where people are going, "Wow, that is a masterpiece." I don't really know of any, let's say, authors today who are considered to be like literary superstars, people who you would people who other writers look up to, other readers look up to, people who are not just commercially successful, but highly respected as an artist. Um, I don't really know of any authors who have that combination. Um, in the 19th century, literary culture was very much alive. Um, in fact, that's one of the reasons why I love the 19th century so much because it was the pinnacle of that. In the early 19th century, you had the Romantic poets like Lord Byron, who were highly. He was in some ways more of a fad in his lifetime, but he was respected somewhat as a poet and also as this legendary danger. He was both in many ways, but he was respected then. He became more respected after his death, but he did receive a level of fame in his lifetime. Then, of course, you had Dickens later, who was treated almost like a rock star. I mean, no author really attained the level of fame that Dickens did in their lifetime. Um, I mean, I envy Dickens so much. I think he really had, I think, what all authors want, like a public that will show up for you, who will listen to your readings, who was both commercially successful and yeah, he was somewhat. Some critics were somewhat skeptical of him because of his popularity, but he had a lot of blessings. There, Dickens was extraordinarily lucky in terms of his in terms of the success that he achieved. Many other authors did not achieve such successes in their lifetime, but Dickens did. And of course, there have always been forgotten artists, like Herman Melville, for example, who was not appreciated in his lifetime. Um, there have always been forgotten artists who were not understood within the period in which they lived. But usually during the same periods, you also had writers who were respected, who were revered, and I don't really see that now. I don't see a living conversation within literature. I do not. I do not see a living legacy. Um, I in the of course then in the 20th century, as new mediums took over, like radio and television, all of that, literature lost some of its cultural sway. But I would say even in the late 20th century, early, or even early 21st century, you still had some authors like Cormac McCarthy and David Foster Wallace who, although they were not famous on like the pop star level, on the pop level, they were renowned and respected within the literary world. I don't think we really even have people like that now. I can't really think of any. Certainly not younger people. If there are some, maybe like George Sanders or whatever, they're older and established. I don't really see up and coming people who have that kind of status or fame. And I'm not talking about fame for fame's sake. I'm talking about people who have a real literary cultural impact on the literary world. I don't really see that. Um, there's no writer that I can look up to and say I would want to be like them. There's no blueprint for it now. Um, I write the trouble with the kind of fiction that I write is that I write fiction that is inspired by the classics, but I tend to write it with modern sensibilities in mind, where I'm talking about modern problems using the past. But the problem is, it can be very difficult to get such books to be noticed. Because on one hand, you have the general public who now doesn't really care so much about complex literature. They essentially want everything to be neatly packaged into a certain kind of genre or something where it's serving them their own sensibility. It's catering to them, and they don't really have to appreciate it as a work of art. It's purely a consumer product. That's the problem with the general public. But then there's also a problem, I think, with the people who read classics, because the problem with them is that they could appreciate such literature, such groundbreaking literature, if they gave it a chance, but they won't give it a chance because they are blinded by what you might call the canon. And so any kind of literature that isn't old or established by the canon, they're skeptical of. But that's a problem because it makes it where you are essentially curating a museum. You're not carrying on a living legacy, a living conversation. If you, I'm not saying don't read classics. I love classics immensely. But if you don't also engage with new work, then you're not really you're not helping to nourish the legacy of literature. You're not carrying it on. You're not keeping literature alive. You're keeping it as a museum piece, a tomb, if you don't actually give new groundbreaking literature a chance. Um, if you are simply a gatekeeper in that regard, then so often the people who I know who read classics will complain about no one reads anymore, no one appreciates literature. But here's the thing: if you don't give new groundbreaking literature by new authors a chance, then you are contributing to that. Because if if literature isn't an ongoing conversation, if it does not leave a legacy, then it becomes stagnant. It does not move forward. The best way to honor classic literature is to create new literature inspired by it. Um, but if you're so close minded that you won't give that kind of literature a chance, then you are essentially killing literature. You are hammering the nail on the coffin because it's not an ongoing conversation at that point. It's frozen in time. And to me, that's the problem with people who read so-called classics but won't give new literature a chance. And so, to me, that's the problem with them. And then, of course, you have the general public who isn't interested anyway. And so, to me, that's why I think literary culture is mostly dead, because there aren't new, up and coming writers who are changing the face of it. Now, it's not that such talented people don't exist; they do exist, um, but they aren't given the exposure that they deserve. And so, to me, that's why I think literary culture is dead right now, because I'm not seeing those new artistic and creative voices within the literary world, or really even within the film world or within other mediums. I'm not really seeing it. And so, to me, that's the problem. And now, that's why I would encourage you to buy books like The Ecstasy and The Ignominy, not just for my own vanity. It's also just to get. It's also just to have that ongoing literary conversation, to have that ongoing um, dialogue with literature and people of the past. Because the way I try to honor classic literature is I try to absorb what I've learned within the writers that I've read, and I apply that and try to create something entirely new. That's what authors should be doing. Yes, we need to appreciate the past, but we shouldn't make it an idol that we can't let go of at the same time. There has to be a balance between those two things. And so, thank you for listening. I could go into this much longer, but I wanted to keep this video fairly concise. Um, Again, if you would like to support this channel, my books are linked in the description section. And until next time, goodbye.